Hey everyone, Liam from Solitude here, and today I'm making a video about something I'm really passionate about, which is the West Australian music scene. Yes, my hometown of Perth has a thriving music community right now, and indie rock in this country seems to only just be getting stronger, mostly because of the output of Perth musicians right now. Yes, we have great indie and alternative rock musicians and artists all over the country, but part of me, and maybe it's bias, just feels like the trends are coming from those over in the West right now, and those that are setting the scene are here in Perth. It just feels like every second big up-and-coming indie rock band that we are hearing about through the music zeitgeist in Australia comes from Western Australia right now. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you'd know some of these bands I'm talking about. You've got the likes of Spacey Jane, old Mervs and DICE, just to name a few. So in this video, I want to just talk about where this all started and why this scene seems to just be thriving. So to assess the current Perth indie rock scene, I think it helps if we go pre and post-COVID. You see, pre-COVID in the Australian alternative music scene, I would say there were probably 4 dominant genres of music. You had your violent Soho inspired grunge bands, Sticky Fingers reggae, Smith Street band Australiana, and of course your Tame Impala psychedelic rock. Of course, there were other bands and artists which I could mention that came in their own sort of little genre packages, but I think all of them were kind of in the slipstreams of those 4 bands and their scenes that they created. And towards the end of the decade, we saw the emergence of a genre which kind of melded all of these together, and I would say it was kind of what we call now surf rock. And in this late 2010s period, we saw the emergence of a band called Spacey Jane in the West Australian music scene. I think that they were like the perfect example of what I'm talking about. A band that was able to mesh those kind of genres and feels together to create a sound and a culture around their music that everyone was able to connect with. In particular with their first EP, which was massive in the Perth music scene. I was running a local radio show at this time, and we would often play this and hear about it getting played on other radio shows in the local scene. I'd say in particular their song Feeding the Family was a great representation of this. It had a lot of elements of these genres that I'm talking about in that one song, and it just connected with a lot of people here in Western Australia. And I'd still say to this day that it is definitely their best song. And as they grew in the Perth music scene, they became an extremely influential band to follow for other up-and-coming artists that were playing alternative and indie rock. They worked extremely hard. They often played multiple shows per week. They must have played hundreds of shows before they even got close to getting played on Triple J regularly. They built their streaming game extremely well, and many of their songs reached over 1 million streams before the national platform of Triple J adopted them to their playlist. So by the time early 2020 came around, they had just recently made a Hottest 100, and their first album was about to be released. It was obviously a huge success in hindsight, with many of the songs getting voted into the next Hottest 100, and they seemingly became the biggest alternative Australian rock band in this country overnight amongst young people. But of course, 2020 also brought about the COVID pandemic, and essentially every establishment in Australia shut down for a period of time in that year. And this of course included local music venues. But when the lockdowns in Western Australia started to go away, one particular venue in the suburb of Scarborough, which is in the north of Perth, opened their doors because of a loophole that they had with a backyard area so they could have a larger area and invite more people in. The Indie Bar was now hosting shows more sooner than a lot of other venues in Western Australia, and they could invite more people in than usual. And many local bands were quick to jump onto this venue as a place that they could get back into live shows. And coming off the success of Spacey Jane, everyone wanted to emulate that sound. And this venue was a place where we started seeing the likes of Old Mervs, DICE, Rah Rah Viper, Coterie, Dear Sunday, and Mitch Santiago playing many live shows throughout each week. And many of these artists tapped onto something that Spacey Jane were doing in particular, with this kind of new surfy indie alternative rock direction that they were taking, which was very popular. I think some of the attributes of this sound that they were trying to emulate were that kind of jangly guitar tone, see not a lot of distortion, and more about kind of hearing the chords come through a little bit brighter instead of crunchier. I don't exactly know how to explain it, articulate, or express it, but the style of singing that Caleb from Spacey Jane does as well was also really influential. I think I'd probably have to say it's like kind of back of the throaty sort of male voice projection. There was also quite a minimalistic structure to the songs, not an overly large amount of guitar takes within the recordings, and often the songs were quite simple, catchy, and emotive at the same time. And all these bands took the opportunity to build their streaming games with the lockdowns, and the indie bar was now the place to be, and essentially the only place you could regularly go to play shows. They created their own little community there, and they all grew together because of this. I feel like they also really captured that group of young people who were looking for their sound that they were able to create. I'm kind of thinking of like your university student who shops at like Ganda or Salvos. That sort of young person that wants the good vibes. I think another thing that happened around this time too was the official transition from Facebook to Instagram and TikTok for musicians. And of all these bands, I'd probably say now that Old Mervs are the ones who've risen to the top, closest to Spacey Jane. And they're kind of the ones who are ushering in the new breed as well. And their big break obviously came in 2022. They were asked to play shows with Spacey Jane. That only just grew their audience even more and attached them to that sound that was already there, that a lot of people were already going for. They also in that year made a Hottest 200, so not quite the 100. And they did this without a lot of attention from Triple J. I think they only might have had a few spot plays of their song that got voted in that year. DICE also had this happen to them. And what I've kind of seen this year, I think, is that Old Mervs shows and those who've supported them have now been growing to be the next breed coming through. The likes of Rah Rah Viper and Full Nelson all seem to be transitioning towards the Triple J cherry on top experience that Old Mervs, DICE, and Spacey Jane have too. So why is this Perth indie rock scene thriving, and why is it so good? Well, the first thing that I think I'd point out is that Perth is an extremely isolated city. We all know that. And in my opinion, the isolation can lead to a craving for entertainment and the aspiration for creativity. Many people may argue from Perth that it can get boring here, and often we see people going to places to find things to do, and it's, local bars. I think Perth also has a bit of a small town feel to it as well, and we all have a bit of a chip on our shoulder about coming from here, and we want to push ourselves and each other forward. The music that these bands are putting out is also really palatable in my opinion. It responds really well to a wide audience. I've often found that both guys and girls get into this sort of indie and alternative surfy rock sound. It's got the traditional elements of guitars and drums that the stereotypical guy music fan would like, and it has the elements that stereotypical girl music fans might like too, the danciness and the jangle. I think ultimately as well, and I've kind of mentioned this already, but they just created a community and they've kind of attached themselves to the young people of Western Australia now. I just feel like I could visualize the sort of young person who listens to this music. They have an aesthetic, they have a look, they have a feel, they have a community, they have a vibe attached to them. It's kind of like when you see a person dressed as a goth, you automatically know the music that they're probably listening to. Like when I see a bunch of teenagers walking out of Gander, I'm just thinking to myself, I bet they listen to Spacey Jane. I'd also say that Old Mervs in particular, their merch game has been really on point lately. They've been able to tap into that sort of like Y2K, or what I would call like new nostalgia vibe with their shirts that they're putting out. They all kind of look like these vintage Billabong and Rip Curl surf shirts that you would see in the 90s and the early 2000s, which people are all about wearing now. Overall, I'm really interested to see where this scene progresses and who in this music community pushes ahead. I feel like that there's some bands and artists in this group that could push forward a lot more, even further ahead of Spacey Jane in years to come. And I think that, you know, a band like Full Nelson is an example of that. They're still really young. They've played a lot of shows with Old Mervs now. They're growing their streaming game really well. I've noticed they've been getting played on Triple J a little bit more this year. And of the group, they excite me personally the most. I think that their music might be on a higher level than some of the other artists that I've spoken about. They just seem to be really good musicians, and a lot is ahead of them. I've got a few more bands that I want to just mention as well at the end of this video that you might not be aware of yet, who are also kind of on the periphery of this scene that I believe you should be checking out. Shout outs to Spicy Water, who are kind of like a little bit more of a skeg sound but with a female vocalist. The Deenies are a really cool band who've played some shows with Old Mervs. They're all British guys who've moved over here to Western Australia, and their music kind of sounds similar to the indie rock scene here in Perth, but as well as, you know, like that kind of Britpop, early 2000s Britpop sound, like Arctic Monkeys, Oasis, that sort of thing. Humble Armada are a little bit more like kind of psyche as well, but they're, you know, big in the local scene here too. King Blue are another female-fronted indie rock band who are doing really well. And a personal favorite of mine is Stem Stella. You need to check them out. A little bit more sophisticated sounding and a little bit more mature. So that wraps up my video, everyone. Thanks for checking this one out. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing this video, and I'll hopefully see you again for another one soon. Bye.